Okay, so picture this. It's the early 90s, right? And this like seemingly ordinary young woman decides to take on like a centuries-old institution.
Yeah.
One that's like steeped in tradition and fiercely resistant to change.
Hmm.
And that's the story we're diving into today.
Okay.
Story of Shannon Faulkner and her fight to enter the Citadel.
Right, the Citadel.
Yeah, the prestigious military college in South Carolina.
Yeah, you know what's so fascinating about the story is that it's not just about one woman's like fight for equality.
Right.
It's like a window into these often overlooked struggles of those who just dare to challenge the status quo, you know?
Yeah.
It also makes you think about how we remember history and like who gets to tell the story.
Right.
So to really get a good picture of this, we're going to be drawing from like court documents, news reports, first-hand accounts.
Wow.
Including this really insightful New Yorker essay by Susan Faludi.
Okay.
We're going to try to paint a picture of this turbulent time.
So to really understand what Shannon was up against,
Yeah.
I think we have to like understand the Citadel itself, right?
Yeah.
Founded in 1822 in response to like a planned slave uprising.
Wow.
It's a place where like tradition reigns supreme.
Right.
And for over a century and a half, that tradition included being exclusively male.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about like separate education.
Right.
There was a dark side to this whole exclusivity thing.
Okay.
And it kind of showed itself in these brutal hazing rituals.
Right, like these rituals that were meant to weed out the people deemed unfit for the Citadel's demanding environment.
Exactly. And, you know, sadly, the case of Harry Delarue back in the 70s really brought the horrific consequences of this hazing culture to light.
Oh, wow.
The stuff he went through, the psychological pressure and abuse, it was just so severe that it tragically led him to take the lives of his own family.
Oh, my gosh, that's awful.
It's a heartbreaking story, you know?
Yeah.
It just really shows how intense that pressure cooker environment of the Citadel was.
Yeah.
And then, like, just a decade later, another incident happened.
Yeah.
This time it was with Kevin Neesmith.
Okay.
And it really exposed, like, how deeply ingrained the racism was within the institution. Upperclassmen actually dressed up in KKK robes and burned a cross in his room.
Oh, my God.
It's just insane. It highlights this culture of intimidation and, like, a serious lack of accountability.
Yeah, and, it's important to remember that these incidents happened during a time when society was really grappling with issues of race and gender equality.
Right.
And so the Citadel, with its all-male tradition, almost became like a symbol of resistance against these like changing tides.
Yeah, they were clinging to a past that a lot of people just saw as totally outdated and discriminatory.
Right, and that's where Shannon Faulkner enters the picture.
Yeah.
And this wasn't some radical activist.
Right.
She was just a seemingly average teenage girl.
Yeah, good student athlete.
Yeah.
By all accounts, like, she didn't really care what other people thought.
So what motivated her to challenge this like bastion of masculinity?
So from what we've gathered from interviews and like her own writings, Shannon's motivation was rooted in this really simple sense of fairness. She was like, why are my tax dollars supporting a school I can't even go to just because I'm female?
Wow.
It was this classic case of taxation without representation.
So she decides to take matters into her own hands.
Yeah, she did.
But how does an average teenager even go about challenging a powerful institution like the Citadel?
Well, she took a pretty ingenious approach, I gotta say.
Right.
She had her high school counselor remove, like, all gender identifiers from her application.
What?
Basically, she tricked the Citadel into accepting her,
Wow.
and it worked.
I bet they were pretty shocked when they realized their mistake.
Oh, yeah, it didn't take them long to, like, revoke her acceptance.
Oh, no.
They even went as far as sending a separate letter to her mother, scolding her for, like, allowing Shannon to even apply.
Are you serious?
Yeah. It was just a really deliberate attempt to shame and intimidate both Shannon and her family. And it really speaks volumes about the Citadel's mindset at that time, this belief that women just had no place in their hallowed halls.
But Shannon, to her credit, refused to back down.
Yeah.
And instead of like shrinking from the spotlight,
Right.
she decided to fight back.
Good for her.
Yeah. She found a civil rights lawyer and filed a lawsuit.
That's when things really blew up.
That's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
So Shannon's case quickly gains national attention, right?
Yeah.
And she turns into this symbol of the fight for gender equality. So the media descends on this like small town of Charleston, South Carolina,
Yeah.
eager to cover this whole David versus Goliath battle.
They love that stuff.
But for Shannon, this whole media attention thing was kind of a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
While it definitely brought attention to her cons, it also exposed her to a level of scrutiny and hostility that's just hard to even comprehend.
Oh, absolutely.
And she faced intense backlash, not just from men,
Right.
but surprisingly from other women as well.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to dig into next time.
All right. Sounds good. So there was this like widespread perception that she was being pushy, like
Right.
trying to force her way into a space that wasn't meant for her. Some people even accused her of being a lesbian,
What?
as if that somehow invalidated her claim to equal opportunity.
Oh, wow.
And the harassment wasn't just online or in the press.
Uh-huh.
It spilled over into her personal life, too.
Oh,
She got death threats, her family's home was vandalized, and she was just constantly bombarded with these hateful letters.
it's just crazy to me that someone would face such vitriol simply for wanting a fair shot at an education.
Yeah.
What's particularly interesting and frankly disturbing is that a lot of this negativity came from other women.
Right.
Why do you think that was?
Well, it's a complex issue.
Yeah.
But I think it reflects like the societal pressures women faced back then, especially during that era. There was this expectation that women should be demure, that they should support the status quo and like not rock the boat. And Shannon, by challenging this all-male institution,
Right.
she was seen as violating those norms.
Right.
And that made some women uncomfortable.
It's almost as if they saw her actions as a threat to their own sense of identity and place in society.
Exactly.
Wow.
And the media, unfortunately, played a role in like perpetuating these harmful narratives too.
Right.
Instead of focusing on the core issue of gender equality, they often sensationalized the story,
Yeah.
highlighting the drama and the conflict
Right.
and fixating on Shannon's personal life.
Oh, wow.
Like they made a huge deal about her weight gain, as if that somehow diminished her worth or the validity of her arguments.
That's insane.
Yeah.
It's a classic example of how women in the public eye are often held to a different standard.
Right.
Scrutinized for their appearance and judged harshly for any perceived flaws.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some abstract debate,
Yeah.
The threats against Shannon were very real.
Yeah, like that terrifying incident at the grocery store
Right.
where a man threatened her and her family.
Yeah, he said he knew where to watch them burn.
Oh, my God.
That's scary stuff.
That's awful.
It really highlights the personal cost of challenging these deeply entrenched systems.
Yeah.
Shannon wasn't just fighting a legal battle.
Right.
She was putting her safety and the safety of her loved ones at risk.
And knowing all that, it's amazing that she persevered for as long as she did.
Yeah, it is.
But what were the Citadel's actual arguments for keeping women out? Like, what was their legal defense?
Well, their primary argument was that women are physically and emotionally inferior to men.
Wow.
And they just couldn't handle the rigors of the Citadel's training program.
So they were saying that women were weaker, more emotional, and wouldn't be able to withstand the pressure.
Basically, yeah.
I mean, that sounds like something out of the 1950s.
Right.
Did they have any evidence to actually support these claims?
Yeah. Not really. They relied on these outdated stereotypes and generalizations about gender differences.
Okay.
You got to remember that at this time, there was a growing body of research that, debunked these myths,
Right.
demonstrating that women were just as capable as men in these physically and mentally demanding situations.
Mm-hmm.
But the Citadel chose to ignore that evidence and just cling to their outdated beliefs.
What's interesting is that they actually implemented stricter physical requirements
Yeah.
after Shannon filed the lawsuit.
Yeah.
Almost as if they were trying to create a barrier to entry specifically for her.
Exactly. It was just a transparent attempt to make it even harder for her to succeed.
Wow. And then there was their second argument,
Right.
which was that admitting women would violate men's right to single-sex education and destroy the unique environment of the Citadel.
Right.
So what did they mean by single-sex education?
Hmm.
Were they arguing that men learn better when separated from women?
Essentially, yeah. They claim that the all-male environment fostered camaraderie, discipline, and leadership skills.
Okay.
That wouldn't be possible in a co-ed setting.
Mm.
And they also argued that men would feel less comfortable expressing themselves or taking risks if women were present.
But there were no equivalent women's-only military institutions,
Yeah.
right? So it
Right.
wasn't really about protecting anyone's right to single-sex education.
Yeah,
It was about maintaining their own exclusive privilege.
you're absolutely right. And their final argument Well, it's almost too absurd to believe.
Okay, let's hear it.
So one of their expert witnesses actually compared women to a toxic virus
What?
that would destroy the Citadel's traditions and esprit de corps.
A toxic virus.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It highlights this fear that's often seen in those resistant to social change,
Right.
This idea that their way of life is both superior and incredibly fragile, as if the mere presence of women would somehow contaminate and undermine the entire institution.
It's fascinating how certain groups will cling so tightly to their traditions,
Right.
even when those traditions are based on exclusion and discrimination.
Yeah.
And it seems like the Citadel was willing to say just about anything to defend their all-male policy.
It was a desperate attempt to hold on to a past that was rapidly fading away.
So after this grueling 2.5-year legal battle,
Yeah.
a federal judge ruled in Shannon's favor.
Finally.
So she finally won the right to attend the Citadel.
Yeah, but as you might imagine, her fight was far from over.
Right, because while the state was ordered to create an equivalent program for women.
Yeah, which would take time.
Right.
Shannon was allowed to attend classes,
Okay.
but she couldn't participate in any other activities.
Oh, wow. So she was essentially in limbo,
Yeah,
isolated and ostracized by the student body.
it was tough.
It must have been incredibly difficult for her to be in that environment, surrounded by people who clearly didn't want her there.
They made it very clear that she was not welcome. Students would deliberately move away from her in the dining hall.
Oh my gosh.
Rules were changed to exclude her from certain events.
What?
And she was constantly reminded that she was an outsider.
And there was even that controversy over whether she would be forced to shave her head,
Right.
which other military academies didn't require of their female cadets.
Yeah, that was a clear example of them trying to humiliate her and reinforce the idea that she didn't belong.
Right.
They wanted to make her conform to their standards to erase any trace of her femininity.
It's hard to imagine the emotional and physical toll this must have taken on her.
Yeah.
You know, she was constantly under a microscope,
Right.
facing hostility from all sides, and fighting an uphill battle every single day.
And it wasn't just the school administration either.
Right.
The media scrutiny was relentless.
Right. And as we discussed earlier, they often focused on the wrong things,
Yeah.
perpetuating these harmful stereotypes and contributing to the negativity surrounding her case.
Oh.
It really is.
Yeah.
All of this while she was just trying to get an education.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how she managed to cope with all that pressure.
Well, it's a testament to her resilience and determination.
Right.
But even the strongest individuals have their breaking point.
Yeah. And that breaking point came just 5 days into her first semester.
Oh, wow.
Shannon left the Citadel.
It was just like everything she'd been through. The constant pressure, the isolation, the hostility, all the threats.
Right.
And then there was that incident where she thought she heard the voice of the man
Oh, gosh.
who had threatened her at the grocery store.
No way.
Like whispering in her ear on campus.
Oh, God.
And whether it was actually him or just like in her head because of the stress,
Yeah.
it totally triggered a panic attack and a complete physical breakdown.
Oh, wow.
She just couldn't go on.
It's important to remember that she was only 20 years old at this point.
Right.
You know, carrying the weight of this monumental legal battle
Yeah.
and facing relentless hostility.
It's understandable that she just reached a point where she couldn't take it anymore.
And of course, the media just pounced on that,
Oh, yeah, they love that.
portraying her as a quitter,
Right.
someone who had let down the entire feminist movement.
They didn't even try to understand the impossible situation she was in.
Right.
Or the toll it took on her.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how we often focus on the individual
Right.
instead of the systemic issues at play.
They should have been celebrating her courage and resilience for even making it that far.
Yeah.
Instead, they vilified her for not being able to withstand what was essentially a campaign to break her.
Right. And here's the irony of it all. Just a year later, the Supreme Court ruled against the Citadel,
Wow.
paving the way for women to attend.
And by then, Shannon's story had been forgotten.
Exactly. It's almost as if the institution was able to, rewrite history,
Right.
taking credit for its forced integration,
Yeah.
while erasing the very person who had made it possible.
And that was made even worse by Nancy Mace, the first female graduate of the Citadel.
Right.
She straight up disavowed Shannon's contribution, saying that Shannon hadn't earned the right to be called a pioneer.
It's just a reminder of how easily we forget the sacrifices of those who fight for progress.
Yeah, especially when it doesn't fit into a neat little narrative.
Right. It's a stark reminder that progress is messy and rarely linear.
Definitely.
So where did Shannon go from there? What happened after she left the Citadel?
Well, she ended up transferring to Vanderbilt University,
Okay.
where she got her degree in English.
Good for her.
Yeah, she became a teacher, got married,
Wow.
and by all accounts, lived a relatively quiet life away from the spotlight.
It seems like she found a way to heal and move forward,
Yeah,
even though she never really got the recognition she deserved.
that's true.
There's a quote from a later interview that's really powerful.
Oh, yeah.
She said, every girl who walks in there, whether she stays for one day or all 4 years, she has won.
It really is a beautiful sentiment. It acknowledges that just challenging the status quo,
Right.
showing up and demanding your place is a victory,
Right.
regardless of the outcome.
It speaks to the power of individual courage and the ripple effects it can have.
And those ripples aren't always obvious right away.
Right. It makes you wonder, would the Citadel have integrated when they did if Shannon hadn't taken on that fight?
Yeah, would they have just kept resisting change,
Yeah, we can't know for sure.
Right.
But her actions definitely forced a conversation about gender equality.
Absolutely, in a place where it had been resisted for almost 2 centuries.
And that paved the way for others to follow in her footsteps.
Exactly, to demand their right to a fair and equal education.
And that's what makes her story so important.
Yeah, Shannon Faulkner might not be a household name,
Right.
but her legacy lives on in every woman who has walked through those gates.
Her story reminds us that progress requires sacrifice.
Yes, and that those who challenge the status quo rarely get the credit they deserve.
It also makes us think about how we remember history. Yeah. And question the narratives that we're often given.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Shannon Faulkner's journey,
Right.
we're left with this question for you to think about.
Yeah.
Do you think she was a hero or a failure? And how to measure success when the goalposts are always moving?
We'd love to hear your thoughts on this fascinating story.